You know what? When I was just doing that, I was making my ear had a ring in it. And I'm not talking about like a ring that you pull out and put on your finger. It just had like a ring in it. That's pretty crazy. You can make your ears ring. Like Dr. Dre and them, keep your hairs ringing. Ring, ding, dong. Ring a ding, 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 dong. Hey, you sitting over there. You better get up out of your chair. And anyway, all right. Man, I've been gone for a minute. There's been a lot going on. So let's jump into this, man. We got some things we got to talk about. We're going to actually have a different kind of conversation today, all right? I want to talk about a phenomenon that is not what people normally think. And so the title of this episode is accurate. It is a sheep in wolf's clothing, not a wolf in sheep's clothing. I'm explaining what I mean in a second. First things first, welcome to CNN. I'm Alfred Hitch Black, which I know about Alfred Hitchcock. Alfred Hitch Black, you know what I'm saying? All of that. All right. I want to bring up something, man, something that people don't talk about a lot, all right? I want to bring this up a lot. I know I've been gone for a minute. I haven't posted in probably like a week and a half, 2 weeks. There's been a lot going on. I don't normally have, like, I can handle a lot of things. I'm just one of those type of people, been shot at point blank range, all that, right? But there are times when, like, the so much is happening in your world, in your church, and all of that you just gotta, you know what, man, I love doing YouTube, but YouTube, it does not pay the bills, and it is a wonderful opportunity, but the responsibility that I have as a pastor at times, I gotta handle that before I can do that. There's a lot going on. Which leads me to this video. And this is a phenomenon that I've seen outside of what I'm talking about, what I'm saying I'm experiencing and just working through in my church. But there's a phenomenon that we know, this terminology called a wolf in sheep's clothing. We know this well. In fact, it is a popular idiom today. And normally when we use terms like they're a wolf in sheep's clothing, typically what we mean are people who are pretending like they're one thing, but they're really evil and not. Their ulterior motives are not. Now, this could be in any kind of category. It can just be between friendships. It can be, in the church where someone's pretending like they're a sheep. You know what I'm saying? But they're a wolf and they're acting all night. I mean, we use it a lot to basically describe a fake person who's evil, that's pretending. You got to watch out for these people. And there's a bunch of different ways we put up signs and all that type of stuff, right? And this has been happening for a long time. This is a popular idiom, a wolf in sheep's clothing. I want to talk to you today about a different perspective, a sheep in wolf's clothing. So wolf in sheep's clothing is someone who has evil intent but is pretending like they're not. But I want to talk about a sheep in wolf's clothing because if you are of the Christian tradition like I am, you probably interact with a sheep in wolf's clothing more than a wolf in sheep's clothing. There are people that are there, and don't get me wrong, but often sheep in wolf's clothing can be the product of the church and not someone trying to disrupt the church. And don't get me wrong, and you'll see what I mean in just a second, so stay with me, all right? This concept, because I think it's one that we miss a lot. So let's jump into this. First of all, the idea of a wolf in sheep's clothing, it really comes out of Jesus. Jesus is the one who introduced this concept of wolf in sheep's clothing. This is where it comes from. So let's look at Matthew 7. This is sort of the tail end of the Sermon on the Mount. And this is Jesus explaining saying this. This is what he says in Matthew 7. It's on the screen. He says this: beware of false prophets, all right, who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves. You will recognize them by their fruits, all right? So this is Jesus. This is God himself. He was warning people, like, beware of false prophets. So in Jesus's mind, a wolf in sheep's clothing is a false prophet. Now, contextually, he was referring to, you had Pharisees, Sadducees, scribes, all of these people who were teaching things and saying things that were not necessarily of God, right? And so Jesus was exposing that. So in Jesus's day, and contextually, his perspective is, beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing. They look like they're with you. They look like they're on your side. They look like they agree with what you agree with, but they're ravenous wolves. He says you will recognize them by their fruits. That's an interesting statement, because if they look like sheep, they come to you in sheep's clothing, you have to pay attention to how they act. He says you will recognize them by their fruits, which is another way of what they demonstrate, what they show, right? That is a wolf in sheep's clothing, a false prophet who really is pretending to be something they're not. But I want to talk about a sheep in wolf's clothing. This is the reverse of what Jesus is saying. So a sheep in wolf's clothing are Christians, people. I'm using this in a Christian context. I'm not going to extend this to the world and all that. In a Christian context, in a church setting, in a small group, in a setting where fellowship among professing believers happens. A sheep in wolf's clothing is a Christian who is slipping into sinful categories, sinful activities in the midst of the church, and they're not really doing anything about it. All right? This is where what I'm saying is a wolf in sheep's clothing comes into the church to disrupt it. But a sheep in wolf's clothing is actually a person who is a believer who's falling into sinful tendencies, and the church is not doing anything about it. All right? So sheep in wolf's clothing are a product of, in many ways, people who either, like believers. You know how there's people, like, let's just be honest, right? There are people in your life, they're either in your church or in your family or whatever. There are people in your life that you know are not living according to what they believe, but because you struggle with fear of man, or you convince yourself that, like, I sin too, I'm not perfect. I need to do a video on it. Can we just put to death the phrase, I'm not perfect? Like, we know, fam, like, only Jesus is perfect. I just say, man, I'm a fallen man, We're not perfect. Like, I wish we would stop saying that. But anyway, you'll tell yourself, I'm not perfect. You struggle with fear of man. I'm sinful too. I don't want to say anything. I don't want to ruffle any feathers. I don't want people to get offended. We come up with a ton of excuses, but all of us, many of us at least, I'll say many of us have people in our lives that are not living according to what they believe, whether that's a Christian or non-Christian. But I'm focusing more on the Christian context. So what's happening is these people are sheep, but they're acting wolfish, if you will. They're acting fake. They're living according like a false prophet. They're not obeying the Lord. They're not honoring the Lord. And you see it, and you're not really saying anything about it for a number of reasons, some of what I just listed a few minutes ago. It's a dangerous thing because the Bible tells us not to actually do that. And we come up with a number of ways that we don't want to say stuff. And so, what ends up happening? We end up allowing people to become wolfish in their actions and their words and all of it. And then we just say, well, that's how they are, or that's just such and such. And it's like, well, if that's true, and if they profess to believe, we have an obligation to help them not be that way, right? So let me give you a couple passages to tell you where I'm coming from with this. Because I think this is very, very common. Very, very common. Very common, where I see this all the time. Believers will not say anything to other believers, or you'll tell the pastor, and then the pastor has to go up and say something. But oftentimes, like, I didn't see the action, or I didn't see it. And then when I get involved, then here's what always happens. People do not want to tell people that they're acting like wolves. You're supposed to be sheep, but they're acting like wolves. You don't want to say anything. You let it grow, develop. Then you tell the pastor, they tell me, and then I got to say something because now it's at a level where I got to say something. But then that person gets offended because no one said anything to them. Or they say, well, that's not what I said. That's not what I did, Pastor Kurt. And then I got to be like, oh, man, now I got to do this whole telephone thing where I got to figure out who said what. And then I get caught. A lot of us leaders, we get caught in the shuffle, right? because people will let sheep become wolves because of fear of man or a high view of themselves. Let me give you two passages to say why I'm saying this, all right? So the first passage is simply this, Galatians 6:2. Listen to what it says. It says, bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. Seems pretty simple. I mean, that's a crazy thought. If you bear one another's burdens, you fulfill the law of Christ, right? That's a great perspective. But then it says in verse 3, for if anyone thinks he is something when he is nothing, he deceives himself. What in the world is he talking about? Why would he say that after saying, bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ? Why is he saying, for if anyone thinks he's something when he is nothing, he deceives himself? You know what he's saying is if anyone thinks that they don't have to bear the burdens of other people, he is nothing. He thinks he's something. Like, I'm not, some people I'm not helping them. That's just them. They're just tripping right now. They're wilding right now. I'm not saying nothing. That's on them and the Lord. No. What he's saying is you're not fulfilling the law of Christ. We're not doing it when we do that. That means you think you're something when you're nothing and you deceive yourself, right? So this is a real concern. The Bible doesn't put it in the terms I'm using, sheep in wolves' clothing, but the sheep in wolves' clothing are actually those of us who are supposed to be faithful, to be like, hey, brother, can you got a second? Can I ask you a question about this? Or you mind if I share something with you? We don't do that, right? We come up with these. Well, I'm not going to do it. I don't know. I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to do that. Look, they just tripping right now. That's between it. No, this is a separate video idea. But this idea between them and the Lord. Listen, the Lord said to Saul in Acts 9, why are you persecuting me, right? Jesus had been dead and resurrected for like 6 months or something at this point. But he said, Saul, why are you persecuting me? He said, who, Lord? Who are you? It's Jesus, the one you're persecuting. Well, he didn't persecute Jesus. Jesus was already gone. He's talking about when you persecute my people, you persecute me. The reason why this passage says bear one another's burdens and fulfill the law of Christ, because the Lord, Christ, works through his people, through the church. But we act like we got this vertical, like, well, I just want to work through it with the Lord. Like the Lord is going to work through it with the people that profess to believe with you in your midst. We treat our relationship with the Lord like he's just going to individually come down and do this thing or say that. And it's like, no, fam. He works through the church. He works through all of us, right? We help each other because we're the body of Christ. Jesus isn't saying, well, listen, I'm going to come down and individually help every person. It's like, no, I'm going to use the people that are around to bear the burden. And by doing that, they fulfill my law because that's what I did for the entire human race, right? So this idea of being a sheep in wolves' clothing is not about the person who's sinful. It's about us being too afraid or too judgmental we talk ourselves out of faithfulness to help our brothers for whatever reason. And we end up thinking we're something when we're nothing, and we deceive ourselves. We have a responsibility. And so we actually let sheep develop into wolves by having a hands-off approach to their actions and attitudes. There's another passage that's even way more serious than this one. And this joint is it's 3 verses. It's a logical argument, but I'm going to pick the first, second, and fifth verse because I don't feel like putting all them on the screen. I'm just lazy. I'm all dirty and all that. You know how it is. Sometimes it's my day off. All right. Here's the other one. Listen to this. 1 Corinthians 5. Listen to this. Here's Paul. It is actually reported that there is sexual immorality among you, and of a kind that is not tolerated even by pagans. For a man has his father's wife. Listen to what he says. And you are arrogant. Ought you not rather to mourn? Let him who has done this thing be removed from among you. Right? I'm going to stop there and I'm going to put the last verse up in a second. Listen to what he's saying right here. That a man is having sex with his father's wife, with his stepmom, in the church. And he's saying it's not even tolerated among pagans. Now, I think there was more going on than that, but he uses this example. And then he says, and you are arrogant. Ought you not rather to mourn? Let me tell you why that's a crazy statement. Because if we're being honest, when we think about this, when you hear about or know of, someone tells you, whether it's by gossip or whatever, but you find out about serious sin in the church, you know what we typically do? We typically self-righteously judge them. we're thinking like, man, they're just tripping. I knew that they were doing this. You know what? I could tell. And we start patting ourselves on the back for being able, having figured it out. We're not mourning. We're not mourning. You know why? Because we're not really concerned that people are sheep that are acting like wolves. We're more concerned about keeping our distance or talking about how we knew. I mean, a number of different things. I'm not saying everyone does this, but this is very common. I see this a lot. People will talk about other people instead of mourning over the fact like, wow, they're like not honoring the Lord and they're doing this in our church. So when he says, and you are arrogant, ought you not rather to mourn? Let him who has done this be removed among you, right? From among you. And then this is what he says in verse 5. For you are to deliver this man to Satan for the destruction of the flesh, so that his spirit may be saved in the day of the Lord. So there's a redemptive aspect to correction and even removal from fellowship if there are sins involved, right? That are serious enough. And what's happening, I see this happening a lot. And even in my church, I think to some degree, my church. So I did this message a few weeks ago about, are you an enabler of sin? Are you oh man, that's funny. I'm drawing a blank right now. But it's, are you an enabler? Are you an exonerator, right? Do you always excuse yourself? Like, no, that's not me. Like when people all bring a thought to you, someone actually has the courage to tell you like, hey, can I actually, if you're always like, nah, I don't do that. It's always someone else's fault. You're just like, no, that's not me. You're always exonerating yourself, right? Or you're enabling. You might be an enabler of sin, an exonerator of sin, right? Or an exasperator, always correcting people, always trying to find out. And I think a lot of people are just enablers, man. We're just enablers. And so we don't mourn when people are sinning in our church. We talk about it. And we maybe even think like, man, I'm glad I don't do that, right? This idea of sheep in wolves' clothing, not wolf. This is not a wrong statement. This wolf in sheep's clothing are people who are not genuine, but who are trying to pretend like they are so that they can fool you. But there are genuine believers who fall into sin, and they're sheep who are in wolves' clothing right now. I have some situations like that in my church right now. And the reality is, like, we're responsible to call these things out. There are times where you hear someone say something and you're like, huh? Did they just say what I think they said? But we're so afraid. We don't say anything. We stand back in judgment. We say all this. Then when it really blows up, then we're the first to say, like I knew that was going to happen. Ought you not rather to mourn? Like, we need to be careful, because sheep in wolves' clothing can turn into wolf in sheep's clothing. After a while, that skin becomes permanent. Like, we're all capable of being a sheep in wolves' clothing. We're all capable of living and carrying habits and patterns that are not becoming of a sheep, right? And if we don't say anything to people, if we're just like too afraid, or we talk ourselves out of faithfulness, we'll end up creating sheep in wolves' clothing. And then we'll just sit there and wonder what happened. How did this happen? A lot of times, and then what happens is, then the pastors, we got to get involved, and then we take the heat. Then all of a sudden, all the language of church hurt and all that stuff, it becomes our fault. And don't get me wrong, there are some pastors who are wilding, who have hurt people genuinely. But some of that church, or some of that stuff, it's just we were the ones that have to get involved and call you out about your sin and challenge you, and because other people just didn't. And then we're the only ones telling you wrong, and then it becomes we're wrong in your eyes. It happens all the time. I just think the state of the church right now is one of significant fragility. I mean, you guys have heard me say this stuff for years about being theological. You know, Christians are so into politics that they just sin against people who don't share their political realm, and we support them. We act like it's a good thing. You know, pick anything. I've been watching tons, like my YouTube feed is ridiculous with Israeli Hamas, and Christians need to support this. And sometimes people just be saying wild stuff, man. The Bible tells us that we got to love all people, do good to everyone, especially those in the household of faith, right? We don't choose sides. There's no favoritism, at least according to James 2. But you'll get people that are just saying wild stuff, and I wonder who's calling them out. Like, I know I can't be the only one. And I'm not saying that I'm the standard. I'm just saying Jesus is the standard. Like, you know how many times Jesus, I can't prove this, right? I can't prove this because the Bible doesn't actually say what I'm about to say. But I truly believe that on multiple occasions, Jesus would say something like this to the disciples. Are you dull of hearing? Like, did you not understand the loaves and the fish? Or you don't understand this parable? How long will I be with you all? Like, Jesus corrected the disciples a lot. We always talk about him correcting the Pharisees. That's the fun stuff. But he corrected the disciples a lot. Why? Because he wanted to make sure that they were focused, sober-minded. I mean, he called Peter Satan. I mean, I don't remember any other time in the Gospels. He called Herod a fox when they said, Herod is going to, he said, go tell that fox. He called Peter the one who, I mean, arguably the leader of the apostles, the one who seemingly, I mean, loved Jesus the most. I mean, he called Peter Satan, right? Like, there's a sense where sometimes we need to just be honest with each other and be like, hey, you tripping, bro. Like, and just take the hit, because it's more important to keep people who are sheep, rather than let them become wolves because we're too afraid of them. We're too afraid to say anything. I'm sinful too, so I'm not perfect. Man, get out of here. The only person that's perfect is Jesus. I wish we would just stop saying that and just be like, all right, and just get the courage. Lord, give me grace. Let me just ask a question. Let me give you just one thought. Ask questions, don't make statements. Ask questions. Just be like, hey, bro, when you said this or when you did that, there are people in my church who talk about other people in the church and have yet to say anything to those people in the church. So do not complain about what people do if you are too afraid to bear the burden and fulfill the law of Christ with them. Don't complain about them then. Don't say anything about what people do if you're not going to say anything about it. I'm trying to grow in that as a pastor. I'm trying to make sure that I do that, because we all fail at these things, right? But what do I know? I'm just trying to make sure y'all keep liking and subscribing. I apologize. I've been gone for a minute. It's been a crazy time, but I got a bunch of different content, a bunch of different ideas coming out. So I'm looking forward to getting back with y'all. I am back. We're doing it. Me and Strack should be back with Cross-Examine this week, all of it. Don't forget to go to kurtkennedy.com. I got everybody's covered. Go to kurtkennedy.com, all right? Hit the like and subscribe button, smash it, whatever they tell you to do. But more importantly, if you don't do any of those other things, listen to what I'm saying and ask the Spirit, is it me, Lord? Is it I, Lord? Do I do this? Are there sheep in wolves' clothing in my life and I'm too afraid to say anything to them? If that's the case, ask the Lord for courage so that you cannot do that, all right? Thanks for watching. Out like shout. See y'all.